Hello everyone. My name is Hillary Steen, and I'm one of the community grants managers at Humanities DC. Welcome to today's workshop, all about the Continuing Oral History Projects grant that is now available. This meeting, as you might see, is being recorded and will be shared out shortly, and it will also be posted on our website. If you would like captions for this presentation, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the ellipses, you should be able to access captions that way. Um, these slides as a PowerPoint will also be available on our website and will be sent out. And if throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to just interrupt me or write in the chat part of the Zoom. If you do have questions in the chat, please direct them to either the whole group or to my colleague Leah Gage, who is also on the call, just in case I don't see it in time. So how today's presentation will go, we will start off with a refresher about Humanities DC and open up the room for introductions, and also provide a refresher about the DC Oral History Collaborative, and then provide an overview of the Continuing Oral History Projects grant, and provide a past example of a grantee in this space. And then we will dive into the specifics of the grant, the application questions, and close out with the review process. And I want to I want to emphasize, in case you weren't able to see this in the request for a proposal or in the reminder about this meeting today, that this grant opportunity is only for past grantees of Humanities DC who have received funding to complete a DC Oral History Collaborative project. So if you are on this call and you have never been a grantee of ours, specifically in order to collect and archive oral history interviews, or you're interested in maybe creating a podcast or a film or something, that's not this grant. This grant is only for previous DCOHC grantees who want to continue their project. So for those of you who are on this call, if that is not applicable for you, then you're welcome to leave the Zoom room. That's totally fine. Or you're welcome to stay on if you are curious about this grant. And so we are members of the grants team. Again, my name is Hillary Steen, and I'm one of the community grants managers. And I'm your main point of contact for questions related to the Continuing Oral History Project, especially around all the grants admin side. And then, Leah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Leah Gage, and I'm the other community grants manager here at Humanities DC.
And Jasper, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jasper. I'm the manager of the DC Oral History Collaborative.
And Loy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Loy, and I oversee our grant making and public programs.
Great. And so we're the grants team. Many of you probably know Jasper very well since you're a previous grantee of ours in this space. Jasper is less involved in the application stage, but if you become a grantee of ours again, then you would work with him very closely. And so now I want to turn the camera over to you. For those of you who are joining us today, if you can introduce yourself, your name, if you're affiliated with any organization, and if you can describe a little bit about the project that you're considering for this grant and why you would like to continue your already funded project. So we can just open up to the whole room. Anyone can get started if you feel brave.
Hi, my name is Leslie Walsh, and I am working on a project called Bank on Her. which explores the effects of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is an act that opened up access to credit to women in the 1970s. And I've had success in this past year, but there are many, many more stories that I'd like to collect.
Great. Thanks, Leslie.
Hi, my name is Deborah Grimstad, and I am affiliated with what is not an organization, but the Fort Totten Storytellers Project, which received an oral history grant previously. We have additional oral history interviews that we want to prepare for submission to the DC Public Library with all the requirements that they have for submitting oral histories.
Great. Thanks, Deborah.
Hello.
Hi, Beverly.
Come on, Beverly.
Hello, how are you all?
Doing well.
Okay, well, I'm Beverly Lindsay Johnson. I'm with the National Hand Dance Association, and we have done several oral history projects, and that were funded by Humanities DC, and we'd love to continue on this journey of documenting the history of DC hand dance.
Great. Thanks, Beverly. All right. So at this point, all of you should already know about Humanities DC and what we do, but just wanted to provide a brief refresher, especially for those who it's been a little bit since you've worked with us. So Humanities DC connects curious people with bold questions to the powerful stories of our vibrant city. We connect residents to storytellers and creators who are already doing humanities work such as yourselves. And we help provide a platform for people to share their perspectives and expertise. And we do this through both public programs and community grants. So you're all well aware of the DC Oral History Collaborative already, but maybe you already know about our community journalism program, our monthly culture series, and our various fellowships. And I highly encourage you all to take a look at our website for any upcoming events that we have, including Leslie's, actually. And the other part of our organization is our community grants. And this year we aim to give out about $1 million to 60 plus grantees across all 8 wards of the city. Right now, we have Cycle 2 applications that are currently open, including for the Continuing Oral History Interviews grant. The application for this one, as well as for a General Operating Support grant, are due on May 1st of 2025, so in a month and a half-ish at 5:59 p.m. And then since you're all previous grantees already, you already know what the humanities are, but I wanted to include this slide here just again as a refresher that the humanities help us learn, they help us empathize, and they help challenge our assumptions through various disciplines, including history, literature, philosophy, etc. And as you all know, oral history interviewing is a key tool in the humanities. And so, again, another refresher for the DC Oral History Collaborative. It is a partnership we have with the DC Public Library that is a citywide initiative to document and preserve the history of Washington's residents and communities through oral history, through grant making, training, and various public projects. And in 2025, we have had 3 separate DCOHC grants opportunities. This one is continuing oral history projects. And back in cycle 1, we also had oral history interviewing, which is for people who are interested in starting brand new oral history projects. And also back in cycle 1, we had Beyond the Archives, which is for people who want to take their oral history interviews and take them beyond the archives to do some kind of public program. For the continuing oral history projects, for those of you who have been part of Humanities DC for a while, this grant used to be called DCOHC Extension. So we changed the name of the grant this year, but it used to be called the Extension Grant. So just FYI. And so for this grant, like I said earlier, it is for DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofits that already completed an already funded oral history project with Humanities DC. And those previous grantees could have been a grantee between 2017, when DCOHC started, all the way up through 2024. The maximum award amount for this is $8,000, although you are also welcome to request an additional $5,000 that is just to translate transcripts into different languages. And the project period is from July 1st of 2025 through March 31st of 2026. So that means that all activities must happen in that time period, and also all funds have to be spent during that time period as well. And even though you're already all pros at doing oral histories, you would still work with us on staff as well as consultants throughout the course of your projects. So we're still always available to help, and we will be with you every step of the way. The final deliverables that are required for this grant include media files, transcripts, indexes, release forms, and metadata for each interview. You should all be aware already of what these entail, but we can, of course, provide additional help throughout the project period if you have any questions about this. And all these deliverables that are required because that allows us to house the interviews in the People's Archive at the DC Public Library. Applications, like I said earlier, are due on May 1st of 2025. And in this slide, there's a link to the RFP, the request for proposal, which really outlines the eligibility requirements, the reporting requirements, and more. That RFP is also listed on our website. And I know some of you, perhaps who are on this call, or perhaps you're watching this later, if you might have, applied for funding in cycle 1 of this year. And if you end up getting chosen for funding from cycle 1, then you will not be considered for a continuing oral history projects grant. You will know if you get funding for cycle 1 projects before the cycle 2 deadline. So before you even submit this application, if you're interested, you would know about your status for cycle 1 already. And so an example of a continuing oral history project, albeit under the extension name, is a project from grantee Claude Elliott. And his project is called Creating Space and Opportunities, DC Black-owned / managed art galleries and spaces. And he started working on this oral history collection back in 2021, which focuses on the challenges faced by Black artists who are forging their careers between the 1970s and the 1990s, and the vitality of Black art spaces as an important sector of DC. And so the requirements for this grant include that you must interview at least 5 new people over the project period. So instead of going back to your previous project and re-interviewing people, you have to find at least 5 new people. There is also an interim report that would be due on November 15th of 2025. And the interim reports are pretty simple. They would include an explanation of the funds that you have spent at that point, and you would also provide a brief overview of progress by that date. And before November 15th, all grantees will have a one-on-one conversation with me and with Jasper to discuss your projects. And a lot of the questions we'll ask you are the exact same questions that will be in the interim report, but we'll just basically do a verbal check-in. And it's possible that we may schedule additional check-in meetings later in the project period, but every single grantee in this program would have a check-in before November 15th. And then the deliverables that I mentioned earlier are all due on April 30th of 2026, which is 30 days after the end of the grant period. So 30 days before April 30th, that's when you would be done with your interviews, ideally, and it's also when you would already spend all of your funds. So on April 30th, that's when the deliverables themselves are due. And that is prepared in a platform called Their Story, which some of you may be aware of already. And we would provide training on Their Story, especially for those who've never used it before. And even if you have used it before, we can always provide a refresher. And so in Their Story, it has all the deliverables that you have already been aware of in the past. So especially for 2024 grantees, this follows essentially the same requirements as your original project. And for grantees from before 2024, it's basically the same as well. But again, always happy to talk more about deliverables if you need a refresher for this. So also due on April 30th of 2026 is the final report. And that report would include an explanation of all the funds that have been spent throughout the entire project period. You would document all expenditures, and this is where you would evaluate your project as a whole as well. And if you become a grantee of ours for this, you will get more info about the final report later on. And for this grant, if you are an individual or a community group without 501c3 nonprofit status, you are allowed to apply through a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which would serve as your fiscal sponsor. You don't have to. Individuals are totally allowed, and community groups are totally allowed to get this funding without a fiscal sponsor, but it is an option, especially because of tax ramifications. We do not provide tax advice ourselves as an organization, but we do have a list of fiscal sponsors that we've partnered with in the past if you're interested in going down this route. So fiscal sponsors assume all financial and legal obligations of the grant. So they're the ones who would actually submit the application, accept the funds, and submit the interim and the final reports. The eligibility requirements that are noted in the RFP would still apply to the fiscal sponsors. And if your original project did not have a fiscal sponsor, but you would like one now, that's usually okay. So just let me know if that's something you're interested in pursuing, and we can discuss it. It's also totally okay if you originally had a fiscal sponsor, but you don't want to use them again, you would like to use a different sponsor, or you would like to apply as an individual, that's usually okay as well. But again, just let me know and we can talk through that further. And so this is outlined in the RFP already, and you might remember this chart as well. So these are allowable and unallowable costs. So this grant program can fund various things, including recording equipment, space rental, salaries, project publicity and promotion. If you end up going with a fiscal sponsor, up to 10% of the total funding can go towards a fiscal sponsor. However, this grant program cannot fund various things, including any non-program related costs, including general office supplies, rent, indirect utilities, also cannot fund things like tuition and scholarships, food and beverages, debt reduction, or any funding to government agencies. If you're interested in doing an interpretive work, like creating a podcast or a film, for example, that would be not for this grant. If you are interested in those kinds of outputs, I encourage you to look at our Beyond the Archives grant. That grant has closed for 2025 at this point, but will open up again probably in December for 2026 funding, because this grant program is only to collect and archive new oral history interviews for an already existing project. And for those of you who have not used Their Story before, some of the costs that are on the left side of this screen, Their Story basically covers some of those allowable costs anyway. So for a transcription, for example, Their Story allows you to have an automatic and AI transcription. So that might lower the costs that will have to go into transcription, as an example. And especially for those of you who it's been a while since you've been a part of this kind of project, this is a project that would require a pretty big time commitment. So past grantees have indicated that it takes between 20 to 50 hours per oral history interview. And that includes conducting research, actually conducting the interviews, if you would like to attend additional trainings, editing transcripts, seeking narrator approval, grant administration, etc. We do provide extensive assistance throughout the project. Even though you've done this before, we are still here. But at the end of the day, this is your project, and it does require a pretty big time commitment, as many of you might remember. And so as you're thinking if you would like to apply for this grant, just keep this in mind. And so after you put the deliverables in Their Story, and again, we are more than happy to provide additional training about Their Story. There are a few steps that they take before everything is actually publicly available in the archives. So you put everything into Their Story, and then we at Humanities DC then send those deliverables over to the DC Public Library, where they perform quality control on these deliverables. At that point, if everything looks good, then they import everything into the People's Archive Digital Repository, DIG-DC, which is something I'm sure you all remember fondly. And then once it's in DIG-DC, that means that everything is published, publicly available, and easy to find for the future. And so before I dive into the actual application questions, are there any questions at this point? Deborah?
I have a question about the requirement that the interviews be conducted during the grant period. What if you have a collection already of, say, 11 interviews that were conducted before the grant period? Can they be included in the grant proposal, or is that during the grant period requirement a very strict and hard and fast requirement? Did you understand my question?
Yeah, so so for those 11 interviews you've conducted already, what are you hoping to do with them?
Get them transcribed, etc., so that they can be ready for giving to DCPL.
Okay. So the grant period is set in stone. This grant would be to collect new oral history. So in addition to the 11 you already have,
Mhm.
and put those interviews that you have conducted during the project period into the
Mhm.
archives.
So I believe I read that the minimum is 5 new,
Yes.
quote unquote new. So if I did 5 more interviews and I did those interviews during the grant period, I could also have worked on the 11 that are old. Yes, maybe.
I believe so, because Jasper, correct me if I'm wrong, that once someone becomes a grantee, they'll have access to their story and they can do other projects in them, right?
Yeah, that should be the case. This might be a question that we have to like think about and come back to, so that we can be sure to be clear about it. Um,
Okay.
Yeah. A good question. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So then let's go into the application. So we weight certain parts of the application, and we divide the application into 5 major sections. And these weights reflect what makes an application successful to the external grant reviewers. And even though the whole application is obviously important, I do recommend that you keep these percentages in mind, and the reviewers also keep them in mind, and your scores that they would provide would reflect these percentages. So the first major criterion is about capacity and personnel, which is worth 10% of your application. And this is basically about who works on the project. So this is about the project director and or if you have other team members as well. And so this is where reviewers would determine if the project director has the necessary passion to bring the project to completion, and if other people are working on the project, then they are clearly identified and their involvement is explained. The second big section is the contribution to DC history, which is worth 15% of the score. And this is where reviewers would determine if the preserved stories that you would like to collect would be interesting to future researchers, residents, and the general public. It is totally fine if your research topic is hyperlocal, but at the end of the day, all interviews would tell stories about life in DC. The next weighted criterion is the project description, feasibility, and timeline, which is worth 40% of your score, which is the largest percentage. And this is where you would talk about the scope of the, excuse me, this is where you would talk about the area of interest or the research topic, and reviewers would determine if the scope of that is both clear and focused. This is also where you would describe why you want to conduct and archive additional interviews for your project. And reviewers would also see if the timeline is actually within the grant period and seems feasible. The next section of the weighted criteria is community collaboration, which is worth 25% of the application. And this is where reviewers would determine if you noted how the project would be strengthened through any collaboration or community involvement. So this is where you would talk about your recruitment plan for finding narrators, and you would identify prospective narrators. And then the last section of the application is the budget, which is worth 10%. And this is where you would describe how the funds will be used. And reviewers would determine if that is clear enough and if expenses are actually directly tied to the proposed project activities. Also, they would determine if any of your budgeted expenses are allowable or unallowable. And something to keep in mind as you're going through the application, that the reviewers might not know anything about your original project. And so as you're writing your application, keep that in mind. It is totally okay for you to just copy over answers from your old application if that's still relevant. But keep in mind that people are looking at it with very fresh eyes. So even though you know your project really well at this point, definitely assume that the actual person reading it has no idea what your project has been before. Okay. So I'm going to jump to the grants portal to show you how everything actually looks. And linked here, and also linked on our website, is instructions for to access the grants management system. Since you are already a previous grantee of us at Humanities DC, we ask you to not create a new account. So if you have lost your password or you would like to switch your email, just let us know and we can get you set up. But this document is still pretty helpful, even though you know the grant system pretty well at this point, especially if you jump down to the grant portal dashboard section. And this really shows you what you should see when you actually log in and how to really apply for a grant as well. Okay, so now going to the application. So this is how the application looks on the back end. It will look a little bit different for all of you, but I wanted to show it from this angle to show you all of the possible sections that might pop up as you're working through your application. So I'm just going to go section by section here. So this section is just some important notes as a reminder for this grant being only for the collection and archiving of additional oral history interviews for already funded and already completed projects, and a few other notes as well. And if you do have any questions about any of this, please email me and I can be happy to answer your questions. Jumping down to the applicant information, this is where you would put information about yourself or about the organization that is applying for funding. And so if you are an organizational applicant, then this section will pop up and you'll have some information to provide about the organization itself. And for those of you who want to do a fiscal sponsorship, the fiscal sponsor would, like I said earlier, submit the application on behalf of the sponsored entity. So they're the ones who would actually sign the application, and the application should come from their account as well in the grants portal. And so you would say yes or no if that's the case or not. And if you're an individual, then this section will pop up instead. And this is where you would upload proof of age and DC residency. And if you're going through a fiscal sponsor, you checked off yes earlier in the application, then this section will pop up. And this would provide information that the fiscal sponsor would put down about the sponsored organization or individual. The sponsored individual would provide proof of age and DC residency, and the fiscal sponsor would submit a letter of confirmation, which basically notes very clearly that they agreed to be a fiscal sponsor. Okay, so now jumping down to the first weighted section, this is about capacity and key personnel. So again, this is about all the people who will be working on the project. So I'm not going to go through all of these questions because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So it has your contact info, for example. and then jumping down to the project director statement of interest / responsibilities. And so in this box, we ask you to write about your passion as a project director. Why do you want to do this project? Remember that the project director is the driver of the project activities. They're usually the point of contact for the grant as well, but this is where you would really explain why you want to do this project in the first place. And then this is where you would put any team members or collaborators, if applicable. They're definitely not required. Most projects do benefit from this so that the project director wouldn't have to do everything themselves. But if you would like to do everything yourself, that is totally fine. If you do want to bring on team members or collaborators, just make sure to explain who they are and what their roles would be in the project. And it is also okay if in your original application, you listed team members there, but you would prefer to not work with them again. That's totally fine. You don't have to work with exactly the same people as last time if you don't want to. Then jumping down to the next section, which is contribution to DC history. And this is where you would describe what makes your project interesting. So how will your project contribute to insights about DC's history? Or continue, I guess, to contribute to insights about DC's history. The next section is the project description, feasibility, and timeline. And so scrolling down a little bit, this is where you would note your area of interest or research topic. And just make sure that this area of interest is very clear because, like I said earlier, the reviewers, so the people who are really looking at your application, might not know your original project. It is perfectly okay, like I said earlier, just to reiterate, to copy over the exact same research topic you had in your original application into here. Or if you would like to reword it a little bit, that's perfectly okay as well. And then total estimated interviews, like I said earlier, all projects must interview at least 5 new people. And then this question is your reason for continuation. So this is where you would explain why you want to continue the original project. Perhaps it's because there were topics that you didn't get to during the initial grant period. Maybe certain people who you really wanted to interview who just weren't available. Maybe additional interviews will just strengthen the topic. For example, there are various ways. You all have your reasons for continuing, and this is where you would describe why you actually want to be doing that. Next question is about the timeline. So this is about all of these steps of your project, basically. We ask you to be as detailed as possible in this space because you have already conducted oral history interviews. You kind of understand the flow already. But again, please be as detailed as possible. And remember that the grant period is between July 1st of 2025 through March 31st of 2026. And so again, the Humanities DC funds can only be spent during this project period. And if you would like to instead or in addition upload a visual representation of your timeline, like maybe a PowerPoint slide or a Word document or something, that's totally fine. And you can upload that instead or in addition to. Then down here is a question about translating your transcripts into a different language. So like I said earlier, you can request an additional $5,000 specifically to translate transcriptions into a different language. And if you want to do that, just keep in mind and ask yourself why you think that would be helpful for your project. And these funds only cover translating the transcripts, So if you would like an interpreter at the interview, or if you want to translate other elements of the project, that usually would not be covered by the translation funds. So you can use the other funds you would receive for this grant for that kind of translation, or you can find other sources of funding for that kind of translation as well. But happy to chat offline about translation if you're thinking of translating anything or specific parts that perhaps would not be covered by this kind of funding. And so if you do check off the yes box, then this section will pop up about the translation enhancement. And this is where you would describe how translating the transcripts will make the stories you collect more accessible. Then the next section is about community collaboration. And so for the first question, this is where you will describe how you will recruit narrators. So please be thoughtful about the narrator recruitment. Hopefully at this point, you already understand the community well enough because you've already done this kind of project before. But how will you recruit new narrators for this project? And ideally, community members and narrators should be involved in the project beyond quote unquote just being interviewed. So perhaps they can help connect the project director to other narrators. Maybe they can help with more general outreach. Maybe they can help with scouting locations for where the interviews would take place, etc. So just be thoughtful about how you're going to recruit the narrators and how they will be involved in your project. Then the next section, which is something that reviewers will not see, is about an optional community shareback session. So like I said earlier, this funding is to collect and archive new oral history interviews for already existing projects. However, you can also do a small semi-private event to share back this oral history interviews with the narrators and their communities at the end of the project period. This is totally optional, don't have to do it, but if you would like to do it, just describe your ideas for that semi-private event. Just be aware that not too many funds should go to this. You can do some funds, but again, most of the funding, most of this project is to collect and archive the oral history interviews. Also, this shareback session is not a really big public event. We have other opportunities for that if you are interested. So this shareback session is small and semi-private. And then here's just some additional questions about your target audience demographics. Then this section is the budget section. And so I will go line by line with the first part of this section, which is the budget table. So the first row is for honoraria, which is what you may pay to narrators or community participants. We highly encourage you all to pay the narrators for their time and labor telling you their stories. The second section is about salaries and wages. And so these funds would be typically what project team members would be paid. So honoraria, you can think of it more as a stipend, and salary would be more of a wage. But it is totally fine that you kind of create your own definition for this. So for example, if you're an organization and you're all volunteer and you're uncomfortable paying someone a salary because they're a volunteer for the organization, that's totally fine. You can plop everyone into honorarium. We just divide honoraria and salary because we consider honoraria to be stipends to narrators and salary to project team members. But it's up to you if you don't want to make that distinction yourself. The next section is travel. So this would be for you or your narrators to get to different locations around the city. So maybe you are interviewing a narrator in their home. This could cover gas or cars or metro, etc. Next section is about supplies. So for example, if you used a microphone for your original project, but you would like a new one because the first one broke or doesn't work too well, you can buy a new one, and this is where you would put that microphone under supplies. Next section is translation. This would be up to $5,000 for transcripts, like I said earlier. And this row is for anything else that's not covered in the rest of the budget table. And so all of the funds that you're requesting from Humanities DC would go in this column here. If you have other sources of funding, which is not required, you're more than welcome to put that in this column as well. And then the budget narrative is where you would describe everything that's in the budget table. So you are welcome to put lump sums in here. You're welcome to put calculations. It's up to you, but just make sure to be very clear about what's actually going into your budget. I recommend taking another look at the lists of allowable and unallowable costs as well, because basically everything that is in this budget table has to be explained in the budget narrative. And if you're requesting the maximum funding amount for this, so the $8,000, not including the translation funds, we at Humanities DC assume that all applicants already have the necessary equipment that was purchased with the original grant funds, and so you wouldn't need the full $8,000. However, you are totally more than welcome to still put the $8,000. Just make sure to explain everything in your budget table. Then the next section, which is totally optional, is the appendix. And this is where you can upload any supporting documents or type supporting information into here. So if you want to do a video response to any questions that are in this report, you would like to film yourself instead of typing everything, you can put that in here. If you have any letters of commitment from narrators, you can put that here. Resumes of project team members, any contracts, any planning documents, etc. It's up to you if you want to put anything in here in the first place, and also which documents those would be. So you have a few sections in here to upload things. So you can upload a file here, or here, or here, and you can just go down the list. And then this section is the accessibility section that would only be required if you're an organizational applicant and your organization has 15 or more staff members. At that point, this section would pop up, and this is about adhering to the Americans with Disabilities Act. This section is not reviewed by reviewers. This is just reviewed by us on staff. And so this is where you would note any accessibility plans that your organization has and how your organization would be more accessible to the public, for example. And so even if this section does not pop up because you're not an organization or your organization is too small for this section, I still definitely encourage you to think about accessibility throughout your application. We define accessibility pretty broadly, so it would be for, yes, the disability community, but also maybe geographic accessibility. So if you're asking people to come to you for the interviews, how can you make it more accessible for those individuals who have to travel to you, for example? So definitely keep accessibility in mind, even if the section does not pop up for you. And then the last section is just the signature section. This is where you're certifying that you're in compliance with a bunch of different laws. And then the authorized signature is possibly the project director, possibly a representative of the organization who can actually sign funding applications, etc. And that is the whole application. Oh, something I forgot to mention earlier. Sorry about that. So in the appendix section, another thing you can put on here, if applicable, are any websites or social media platforms. We tell reviewers to not do their own research for any of the applicants. So if you want if you want the reviewer to take a look at your website, for example, or your social media handles or anything else, put that in the appendix section and they can then look at those items. Okay, so before I go back into what makes an application successful, does anyone have any questions about individual questions in the application? All right, so now going back to the slides. Okay, so successful applications means that the reviewers would score your application highly. So I keep talking about reviewers, so I will now explain what those reviewers actually do and who they are. So the grant reviewers are external community members who have some kind of connection to the humanities in DC. And we on staff would review your application for certain things, but it's really the reviewers who essentially determine who the grantees are. So when you are writing your application, don't write it thinking that we on staff who know your project really well already will be able to score your application. Instead these external grant reviewers who do that instead. And I'll talk about the actual review process later in the presentation. So successful applicants would note in their application that they have a clear and detailed research question, and they explain clearly about why oral history is the best format for the continuation of this project. You would provide ideas about how you would connect with the community, and your passion shines through in the application. People's roles are defined, things make sense, and things look clear. Also, successful applications would only request funding for, I know I've said this before, but just reiterating, to collect and archive new oral history interviews for already existing and completed projects with Humanities DC. And the biggest thing that I recommend is that you make your responses as detailed as possible. And then on the flip side, there are some common application issues that we have noticed on staff and that reviewers have brought to our attention as well. So, for example, your project scope might be too broad. Because you have already been funded by us before, this might not be too common to happen. But just make sure that when you are writing your area of interest or research topic, that you make it very detailed. Also, an issue might be if you don't explain why your project is important to DC, why oral history is actually the best format for your project, why you want to continue working on this project, things like that. Also, if your application seems like it was written in a rush, then reviewers will probably pick up on that as well. And like I've been saying, reviewers likely will not know your project. And so an issue would be if you assume that they do know your project well. The biggest issue that we see for applications is that responses are not detailed enough. And something that we offer to all applicants is something called draft review. So if you would like us on staff to read through your application as it stands, we are happy to provide feedback on that draft application. This feedback request has to be given to us no later than April 21st at 5 p.m. So if you are interested in having us on staff read through your application, provide feedback, please make sure to request that feedback no later than April 21st at 5 p.m. And even though we won't be able to tell you if your application will get funded, we can provide some more feedback about how clear your application is, if we recommend being more detailed in certain places, things like that. That will hopefully make your application stronger for the review side. All right, so before I dive into the review process, are there any questions at this point? And Leia, are there any questions in the chat that should be brought to the whole group?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So yeah, there, Beverly, I see your question here, and maybe I can just bring that up. So the question around whether if you applied to a grant last cycle and wish to apply for this grant, you could still apply, but if you received a grant in cycle one, if you find out, then you would not be eligible for this grant. So we expect to send out those decisions in the second week of April. We are currently on track to be able to do that. I realize that that kind of puts a burden on those of you who wish to apply for this grant and aren't yet sure if you've received that other grant. But so hopefully, hopefully that will give you enough time, if you're able to continue thinking about the project that you're planning to apply for continuing oral history. Another option is that you could work with somebody else, who was on the project potentially to apply. But feel free to reach out if you have specific concerns about that, Beverly, or anyone else here on the call.
Thanks. And Judy, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, I got on a bit late, so let me ask a question. Is this grant for people who have previously applied, or this will be my first time applying?
So this grant is for previous grantees of ours. So if you have never received an oral history grant from us, then you would be ineligible for this particular grant.
Okay.
But we definitely encourage you to stay in touch. We will open, if you're interested in conducting a new oral history project, then we will open up the 2026 round of funding probably in December.
Okay. Nothing. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye.
Any other questions? All right. So going into the last section. So all submitted applications are reviewed by Humanities D staff for eligibility. So eligibility means that we can theoretically fund your project. So for example, if you are an organizational applicant, we would check your 501c3 registration status, for example. If your submitted application passes eligibility, then your application will be then sent to the external reviewers who would be the ones to actually score your applications based off the weighted review criteria that I talked about earlier in this presentation. That review criteria is also listed in the RFP and in the application itself. And if you are interested in being a grant reviewer, we encourage you to join that team. That would be, excuse me, so you would be, sorry, let me take a step back here. If you're interested in being a grant reviewer, you are welcome to be both an applicant and a grant reviewer, but you would just not review applications for the same grant program that you apply to. So if you end up applying to get funded for the Continuing Oral History Projects grant, but you're still interested in reviewing applications in cycle 2, then perhaps you would be interested in reviewing for our General Operating Support grant, as an example. So we have 2 grants available in cycle 2, which is this one and the General Operating Support grant. However, we also definitely accept intake forms for reviewers on a rolling basis throughout the year. So if you're interested in maybe reviewing for us next year or the year after, for example, you're more than welcome to check out our website and submit the intake form for the future. And with the review process, applicants, grantees, and future applicants have been reviewers in the past, and they get a lot out of this experience. Reviewers learn about very cool projects and organizations throughout the city, and it also gives them a strong idea of what makes a good application because they're the ones to actually review the applications. It's also a great networking opportunity with other humanists all over the DC area, and people seem to really enjoy the whole process. If you end up becoming a reviewer and moving through the whole process with us, you would receive a $125 honorarium as a thank you for volunteering your time for the review process. So if you're interested, please check out our website. I'm also available to answer any questions if you are interested. So once the reviewers actually go through that whole process, then we on staff look at these highly scored applicants, which are the likely grantees. So these are the applications that the reviewers scored the highest. And then we send to the Humanities DC board something called a slate, which is the list of the likely grantees. And we also send the board an overview of the review process that we followed for that review period. The Humanities DC board does not vote on the grantees, and we on staff do not vote on the grantees. The board affirms if we on staff followed the review process correctly or not. And the staff review of these highly scored applicants would include us doing a deeper dive into your budget, for example, and other elements. Because you're a likely grantee, you just want to do another review before funding gets sent out. Once the board affirms that the review process was actually followed, then we will tell all eligible applicants if they get funding or not, roughly 8 weeks after the application deadline. So we move pretty fast for these decisions. And if you are a grantee, then you will receive your funds approximately 2 weeks after you're notified that you are a new grantee. And that is a presentation. So are there any more questions at this point? All right, well, not hearing any. Thank you all so much for being here today for today's workshop. If you do have any questions about the application, please reach out to the grants team or to me directly. Happy to answer your questions. And I wish you all the best with the application and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.